Good evening and welcome to the June installment of the IDC Speaker Series. This is an opportunity to get together, enjoy dinner, enjoy company, and hear about some interesting topics from some interesting people. Thanks for joining us this evening in Washington, D.C., and to those of you watching online, welcome. We're glad to have you listen in as well. With the Syrian civil war raging on now for over 12 years, and the ISIS genocide having commenced nearly a decade ago, the Christian communities of Syria have paid an especially high price. Christians in Syria are among the world's oldest Christian communities, and to this day, the sacred Aramaic language spoken by Jesus himself is their daily vernacular. And they remain the guardians of a 2,000-year-old Semitic Christian heritage, but now they find themselves on the brink of extinction, which sadly may come to fruition in our lifetimes. And with them, their 2,000-year-old Christian heritage would also disappear. The threat to Christians in Syria takes on many forms and is faced on many fronts. And it's not a straightforward problem, so there's not a straightforward solution to it. Today we're excited to welcome Nadine Maenza. Nadine's a longtime friend and member of IDC's Board of Advisors and the former chair of the U.S. Commission on International Freedom and currently the president of the International Religious Freedom Secretariat. Tonight, Nadine will help us to decode the complex problem set facing the Christians in Syria. And specifically the Christian community that we're speaking of tonight. It'll no doubt be an interesting talk, so without further ado, welcome Nadine.
Thank you so much. Let me get myself set up here. Thanks all for coming, and of course thank Richard and Indefensive Christians for hosting me today and for caring about these issues. So I know some of you may be wondering, why is a non-Syrian speaking about Syrians and Christians in Syria? And I don't pretend to speak for these communities. If you've worked with me at all in Iraq and Syria, you know that I come alongside these communities. I try to raise their voices and highlight their voices, and I try to stay connected with them. But I do admit that being at USURF during the time of the Turkish invasion, spending so much time in northeast Syria and having a close relationship with a lot of U.S. officials during the last administration and this one has kind of given me a unique view of U.S. policy and the struggles with it and how it's impacted Christians, Yazidis, and other religious minorities. So I'm really blessed to be here today, and thank you so much for coming and being willing to listen. So there we go. Okay, I'm making sure I'm doing this right. Syria has a long history of religious pluralism. In ancient times, Lebanon, Jordan, and Israel were all considered Syrian lands with very diverse populations. In fact, the name Syria is derived from the Syriac-Assyrian people, reportedly once 80% of the population before Islam arrived in the 7th century. It's important to remember that Christianity is not a foreign religion, and Christians are not foreigners, but the original inhabitants. The earliest reference to Syrians is in Genesis, listed in the lineage of Aram, a descendant of Shem, Noah's son. Syria would be called Aram, Aramea, and also Assyria. And of course, Damascus was central in the New Testament as Saul became Paul on the road, meeting Jesus on the road to Damascus. When I cross into the Tigris River into northeast Syria, I'm always in awe of the remarkable history on the ground here, and don't take that for granted. I wanted to start by taking a look at Syria right now so you can kind of see who controls what. The yellow is controlled by the Autonomous Administration in North and East Syria and the Syrian Democratic Forces. The red, of course, the regime. The teal is by the Syrian opposition or Turkish-backed militias. And then the gray is Idlib. So I was fortunate to serve as 2 terms, as you heard, on the Commission on International Religious Freedom, my last year as chair. And we made some pretty bold recommendations to the U.S. government. When we first did, I remember some laughs and it wasn't received as well as we'd hoped, but it was really interesting how, as years progressed, they started implementing them, and it became the opposite. They were inviting us in, wanting to hear ideas for how to think differently about Syria. And the most important one, I think, the most important one was to engage with the Autonomous Administration, because when I first started, the U.S. government didn't actually talk to that government, only to the militia, to the Syrian Democratic Forces. So that change, which was a huge, probably the biggest change, was that. And then, of course, lifting sanctions on northeast Syria. And since then, as you heard, I work at the Earth Secretariat. What we do is, when I was at USURF, I learned the importance, as I was working with government, with governments, going on the ground in official delegations, the one thing that struck me the most about that was the importance of civil society. Because every place I was seeing an improvement in conditions, I was seeing civil society doing work on the ground. So that I was really excited when I left GSERF to join our Secretariat and really work on that, because that's really where my heart is. And so we currently have about 40 roundtables in Washington, D.C. and all over the world, including one in Syria. And we have our forming regional secretariats to organize the work, and we have a global series of summits as well. The last USERF hearing I chaired was on religious freedom in Syria last May 2022. And Ethan Goldrich, the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State overseeing Syria, opened the hearing and said, for the first time I could find, that religious freedom needed to be part of a political solution for Syria, saying, quote, promoting universal respect for religious freedom is a key U.S. foreign policy priority. We continue to strongly support efforts to realize an inclusive Syrian society that includes rights for members of all religious and ethnic minority groups. Such efforts are necessary to secure a lasting and stable peace and support the political process outlined in UN Security Resolution 2254. I think if only religious freedom had been a part of the framework early on, we may have seen the U.S. pushing things differently in a different direction instead of having the U.S. support the Turkish-backed Syrian opposition, with many great people in the diaspora and in Washington and Geneva and even in Istanbul, but being militias on the ground, being with harsh conditions for religious minorities and Christians in particular. Sometimes religious freedom and the impact policy will have on religious and ethnic minorities is pushed aside because the area is too important. And actually the opposite should be true. If it's that important, then it's all the more reason to include human rights and religious freedom, because it's the only way, as Deputy Assistant Secretary Goldrich said, it's the only way for a lasting, stable peace. And if that's really U.S. policy, then we can't ignore these issues until the very end, because at that point in time, it'll be too late. So right now, the U.S. policy in Syria is to de-escalate, more humanitarian support, and ensure the enduring defeat of ISIS. It's really not a policy. Those are priorities. And de-escalate really means the status quo, and frankly, the status quo is not possible. And the U.S. is also supporting U.S. Resolution 2254, but it's only a solution on paper, and it hasn't worked in real life. And we could spend all night on that, so we're not. But so really the question is, what is the best interest of Syrian Christians? And it really is a lasting and stable peace for Syria, because that's where they live and they're a part of all of that. But a piece of trying to figure that is understanding the whole situation. So I'm going to go through kind of the civil war, and I know a lot of you probably know it, but some of you might not, to understand just how complex this is for Christians, and then try to imagine being a Christian on the ground in this situation and figuring out what to do and what the cost will be to your family. It's so easy for us to look far away and judge, but if you're living there and this is your life, it's a totally different story, and I can imagine how hard that would be. So it's important to understand that since the 1963 coup by the Ba'ath Party and then Hafez Assad's coup in 1971, there has been a policy to divide and conquer, often pitting religious groups against each other. With Assad being an Alawite, his religious community was catapulted to high levels of socioeconomic status when he took over after years of being marginalized. Christians were told to stay in their place or pay a price. The Secret Service, or the Mahabharat, infiltrated churches, and every institute supporting the regime just was not supporting the regime was not an option. Those that opposed the regime simply disappeared, especially religious leaders. Some Christians remained prominent, but the community as a whole was isolated from the Sunni majority. In 1982, Hafez al-Assad put down the Muslim Brotherhood uprising in the city of Hama, killing more than 25,000 people. The regime's opponents would use Hama as a rallying cry when the civil war began, because that was a blueprint the regime used to respond to dissent. And in 2000, Bashar al-Assad became the president when his father died of a heart attack. Now, his brother, Basil, had actually been the one that was being groomed to be president, but he died in a car crash in 1994. So when he first came on, the narrative was that he was a reformer. There was a lot of excitement, a lot of congressmen visiting, Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton had a lot of nice things to say about him. But the people on the ground just saw continued brutality, and nothing had changed. If anything, Christians felt like, and other minorities were like hostages, paralyzed because of the potential danger to them and their families for appearing to be disloyal. A key moment in the Northeast was on March 12th. Whoops. Okay. 2004, when a riot broke out after a championship soccer match between the local Kurdish team and one from the majority Arab town of Deir ez-Zor, with 9 Kurdish youths being killed. And so the next day, Syrian security forces opened fire on a Kurdish funeral procession leading to mass demonstrations throughout the country. A lot of people aren't aware that this was such a key moment. So you had protests in Aleppo, Damascus, and even in Europe. And in the Northeast, over 30 were killed, hundreds were wounded, and over 2,000 arrested. Now, eventually, things would go back to the status quo and quiet down. But this was a rallying call in the Northeast. This is when they started self-organizing very quietly, and most people are very unaware of this. But this moment they look back at is the one that started everything for them. In December 2010, just a heartbreaking moment that really was the catalyst for the civil war that would turn everything upside down for Christians and for everybody in Syria. So in December, I should say in March 6, 2011, but what had happened is these schoolboys in Dara, who had been inspired by the Arab Spring that had started that December before, had spray painted "The people want to topple the regime" in Arabic on several places in the city. And soon after, these 15 boys between the ages of 10 and 15 were arrested by the secret police, and they were beaten, bloodied, and the whole country just came into an uproar over it. And this is actually a protest in Damascus, showing how angry they were. One of the boys that was arrested recently, he was 15 when he was arrested, he says he now wonders if it was worth it. He lost his brother to an airstrike, his father to a broken heart 10 days after his brother died, and he helped his mother raise their siblings, having fled to Jordan. He says, "I sacrificed everything. Who would have believed the regime would kill its own people with chemicals and warplanes?" Fear of what would become of the Northeast if the Syrian regime attacked them motivated them now, so they moved to really building up the People's Protection Unit, and the YPG started organizing with a lot of fervor there. And if you want to read more about that, Daughters of Kobani kind of tells the story of how the Northeast started organizing at this point in time. Continued opposition immediately began organizing against Assad for good reason, as he continued this brutal attack on all his own people in Homs, Damascus, Dara, and other cities. And so a group of defecting officers formed the Free Syrian Army in June of 2011. A few months later, they began organizing politically in Istanbul, along with the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood that had been banned from Syria for a few decades, and they formed the Syrian National Council. And by 2012, they had 100 countries, including the U.S., recognizing it as the legitimate representative of the Syrian people. They would merge with opposition groups to form the Syrian National Opposition Coalition for Opposition. They had a few names, so we're just going to call them the Syrian Opposition. And they did have some success in early on. They captured key bases in Aleppo, and there were a lot of Christians that were part of the opposition. I know a lot of fine Christian men. This here, the president of the Syrian Opposition now, there are some presidents in the past that have literally been terrorists, but he actually was baptized, even though he's a Muslim, he was baptized in a Syriac church in Qamishli because they were close friends with others. He believed in pluralism, but so many of the people involved in this process at this point, it's complicated, right? All they wanted was for Assad to be removed, and Turkey kind of took it over, and they end up in kind of a different situation than they would have expected. A lot of people here probably know that the U.S. spent $1 billion covertly training the Free Syrian Army to try to turn them into a fighting force, and I think 4 of them remained. $1 billion, do the math. So the U.S. trains all these moderate Sunni Muslims. The UK, Qatar, Saudi provides them arms and training, and most of them go off and join Islamist groups. So now we have trained people with all of these folks that are targeting Christians and other religious minorities. So when people want to just pull everyone out of every country because the U.S. it hasn't always gone so well, these are the kind of reasons they're looking at when they come up with those conclusions. And I totally understand that. And as the war deepened, of course, the regime and Syrian opposition became dependent on international players, Assad on Russia and Iran, and the opposition on Turkey and the U.S. Missing from almost every single timeline on Syria, I have all these books on Syria, and some of them are just fabulous, and sometimes they don't even mention 1/3 of the country that was set up by really with this revolution. So this is in 2012. A coalition led by Kurds, but with Syriac Assyrians, Arabs, and other religious and ethnic minorities, even Yazidis, peacefully filled government buildings in northeast Syria, and at the same time, the YPG and aligned militias, the Syriac Military Council, shut down major roads. And in a bloodless coup, the Syrian regime then pulled out of northeast Syria. So it was these three is what started Afrin, Kobani, and then Jazeera, Canton. And so this really, Assad felt like he couldn't fight this, and plus never really had an interest in the Northeast, frankly, didn't provide a lot of services for them. So wanted to focus on fighting the Syrian opposition closer to home and gave up. So then they started, really setting up their government here. This is the social contract. So in 2014, after 2 years of going door to door and having town hall meetings and giving every resident the opportunity to give input, they passed this. And as you can see, the preamble of the social contract states that the people of the ANES include the Arab, Kurds, Christians, Assyrian, Chaldeans, Syriacs, and Arameans, Yazidis, Turkmen, and Armenians. And I don't know if, can you all read this? By our free will, we declare this contract to achieve justice, freedom, and democracy in accordance with the principles of ecological balance and equality, without discrimination. Sorry, I seem to need to look at the mic. Based on race, religion, belief, or gender. The goal of this contract is to enable the political and moral fabric of the democratic society to achieve its functions, which are mutual understanding, coexistence within pluralism, respect people's rights for self-determination, the rights of women and children, self-protection and defense, and respect for freedom of religion or belief. Now remember, this was written in 2012 before ISIS. So they didn't write this for us because no one was watching. They didn't write this so the world would say, oh, they're the answer to ISIS. They're actually trying to change their culture to make it more, to make it pluralistic. In fact, what they did, they had 3 tracks. They had a track that was for political parties, they had a track for government, and then they had what's called TED-Dev, which was building civil society. So they were robustly trying to build civil society after Assad had destroyed it. And of course, what we've seen right around the world is places that don't have civil society, it's really hard to improve their religious freedom conditions. It's hard, period, on people without having, and they have to rely only on government. And of course, we know that doesn't go so well. So that, as you can see, first of all, I don't know if you guys can tell, this is Afrin, this is Kobani, and this is Jazeera. So the chaos and violence by the Assad regime created the perfect conditions for Islamists to rise in Syria, and in some respects merge with the Syrian opposition on the ground. And of course, this was the worst possible situation for Christians, Yazidis, and other religious minorities. In January 2012, Jabhat al-Nusra, or the Nusra Front, announced it was now the front for al-Qaeda, its franchise in Syria. So that's the same year that the government popped up in northeast Syria. A group breaks from al-Qaeda in Iraq that's even more brutal, of course, calling themselves the Islamic State. And Assad even contributes to these groups by releasing Islamists from prison. He hoped the contrast between his secular rule and alternative Islamist rule would actually favor him. So could you imagine? It's hard to believe sometimes. You have to read like several sources to actually know if it's, because it seems like it can't possibly be true. So in March 2013, the Syrian opposition takes Raqqa, but in a space where the Free Syrian Army and the Nusra Front and ISIS are all living there together. I mean, that's kind of the environment. Could you imagine the people of Raqqa? And ISIS eventually takes it all over and becomes the headquarters for the ISIS caliphate. Al-Baghdadi, the leader of ISIS, moves from Iraq to Syria and starts attacking rebel groups, including the Nusra Front. In June 2014, he declares a caliphate, stretching from Aleppo to parts of Iraq as they commit genocide against Yazidis, Christians, and other religious and ethnic minorities. In September 2014, ISIS launches the siege of Kobani to take the city, and that would be right here. So to take the stronghold of the Kurdish movement. And since the U.S. training the Free Syrian Army failed spectacularly, they end up partnering reluctantly with YPG, providing airstrikes as the YPG went door to door, house to house, fighting against ISIS. In January 2015, the YPG won the Battle of Kobani and then would eventually push ISIS out of Manbij, Tabqa, and then Raqqa. But the important thing is while they were liberating these areas from ISIS, so as they're pushing away they're going this way and pushing away, they're also empowering local citizens to set up self-governance to fill those security voids. And I think this is the missed story, because to me, this is what we should do every time there's a military conflict somewhere. And so, just like they had done in the Kurdish areas, and I understand the U.S. urged them to do so. And so last May, some of you might have heard the story, I met with some women in Raqqa that was with my daughter, and I were there. And, knowing that they did not leave their homes before ISIS, I said to them, what it was like with their husbands, fathers, guardians, when they allowed them to get involved in administration, because these were all women that were leaders, because I forgot to mention half the leaders in the Thomas administration are women. So I'm sitting with these Arab, and they're all very modestly, still covered, very, very dedicated to Islam, just a very religious community, but now the women have these roles in government. And I said what their husbands and fathers had thought when the autonomous administration came to start self-governance. And they looked confused. They looked at each other, I remember, and then through the interpreter said, what do you mean the autonomous administration when they came? Nobody came. We're the people of Raqqa. We're the women of Raqqa. We built the government of Raqqa. No one came. They just what are you talking about? Because, of course, I'm imagining they're coming. It's no, they're freeing them and saying, okay, set up governance, go. And they really did it themselves. It's really quite something. It shows you that even the local people in each area really did set up the governance, which is why it has legitimacy, which is why it's worked. So almost a month after the Battle of Kobani on February 23rd, 2015, while the YPG was mainly still battling ISIS right outside of Kobani, the Syriac Assyrians in the Khabur Valley, they awoke the early hours of that day to the sound of rushing water from the Khabur. Now, this was the first time the Khabur had been dry because Turkey had built a dam about 20 years before and was controlling the water. So they hadn't had a very full river in years. It was the first time it had ever been this full. So with a raging river now dividing the Khabur Valley, ISIS descended down the mountain here from this side, the Jabal Abdul Aziz Mountains, trapping the villages on the southern side of the Khabur. Over 250 women, children, and men were kidnapped, eventually taken to the ISIS Shadadi base. And so they came from here and here, and then they came in this way, and then they held them all kind of right outside of Tel Garan. This was just weeks after ISIS had killed the Coptic Christians on the beach in Libya. So you can imagine they expected the same fate, as did their families. During the first 2 days they held them, they actually took them back to the mountain and held them, and they tried to get them to convert to Islam, and not one of them would, even though they thought their fate would be what the Coptic Christians experienced in Libya. So it just says a lot about who these people were and how strong they were, and how we've seen consistently in Syria and Iraq, the people of faith might worship differently than a lot of the people do in America, but their faith is strong, solid. So this ended up being a different situation in that ISIS demanded a ransom. And he delivered a note, through releasing people, delivered a note to the bishop of Hasaka saying that he would release them if he raised the money to pay them, which they ended up doing. And but it wasn't happening very quickly, so in September of that year, ISIS released a video executing 3 of the men in orange jumpsuits to prove to them that they were serious about wanting that, the payments. And so they released them in small groups over the course of a year, and as they were releasing them, they were telling them, leave the country, or we will. If we find you again, we'll kill you. So that's why so many of them left. There are still some in northeast Syria, not a ton in the Khabur. I'm actually working on something about that now, but there are some that have come back, and some actually overseas that have come back. But initially, everyone fled because, as you can imagine, on Easter 2016, the final hostage was released. So the 15,000 Syriac Assyrians that lived in these 35 villages were actually settled here by the League of Nations in 1933. Their families all fled the Armenian genocide in 1915 and the Samul massacre in Iraq in 1933. Could you imagine the history of suffering that they've had through each generation? So in September 2015, kind of at the same time this is happening, basically, after 2 years of fighting, Jabhat al-Nusra and the Nusra Front took over all of Idlib, pushing Assad's forces out. And Idlib is the only significant pocket of rebel resistance that's still left. And so they changed their name, the Nusra Front, to Hayat Tel al-Sham, the HTS, and is now designated a terrorist group by the UN and the US. This is one of the worst places to live for Christians in Syria. There's reports of rape, torture, forced disappearances, and killing in detentions, according to the UN Independent International Commission of Inquiry. They have employed arbitrary detention and criminal prosecution for slander and blasphemy, and have morality police to enforce religiously justified dress codes for women. Most Christian land has been taken and redistributed to the HTS members. Before the Syrian Revolution, some 10,000 Christians resided in the area. Most Christians now have left and moved into government-controlled areas. Only a fraction of the Christians remain, and they're all elderly. HTS has worked hard to try to rehabilitate their image, and they now call it the Salvation Government. And leader Abu Muhammad al-Jilani has done some press where he's talking about his support of Christians and giving land back to the Christians, and wears a suit now. He doesn't dress in the Islamic clothing, and is getting some of the press to write these favorable stories about him. Other than Idlib, in December 2016, Assad recaptured the last area the rebels were holding in eastern Aleppo, which had been contested since 2012. So many civilians were massacred those last few days when he retook that land that a UN spokesperson called it a complete meltdown of humanity. It's heartbreaking. So Raqqa was liberated by ISIS by the Syrian Democratic Forces and the U.S.-led coalition to defeat Daesh in June of 2017, but the caliphate was not actually eliminated until February 2019, so just 4 years ago. So this is like a baby government. The Autonomous Administration is no longer a Kurdish project. It's multi-ethnic, multi-religious. It's actually majority Arab. Even the SDF is majority Arab now, with Syriac Assyrian militias involved in the structure, and especially in the Christian areas on the border of Turkey, are all controlled by or defended by Christian and Arab forces. And this government has adopted 3 official languages: Kurdish, Arabic, and Syriac. And the flag signs everywhere. I brought in Piri Abraham from Free Yazidi Foundation, came in with me, I guess in March, and she apparently knows some Syriac. So she just kept, look at the signs, and everything's in Syriac, because of course I just see writing. But every sign, like the women's restroom, is going to be in those 3 languages. So you literally see the language of Jesus, the closest to what people are talking now, is just the regular language there, which is really something. I mean, I think it's important to understand that this isn't a hastily thrown together government, but carefully planned democracy that fills the governance and security voids that normally occur when bad actors are eliminated. And just think how things could have been different had we done this in the Nineveh Plains and Sinjar. I mean, I just think about the security gaps that we left there when ISIS was defeated, and of course the Iranian militias filled those. Someone's going to fill them. So that's why I hope we can learn from what they've done and look at places like Yemen or other places, like how can we, in an area where we don't have sovereignty, how governance could be set up where the people can protect their own rights and work together. I think there's a lot we can learn by how they did what they did. We wouldn't even talk to the government. And so they formed all of this without U.S. input. And in some respects, I think that's why it's so good, because it's theirs. They own it. It's interesting because Brian Bouchard, this business coach, he says the 5 most important words in leadership are people support what they build. And there you go. If you have Afghanistan where you spend $1 trillion training a military, but if the government, you have nothing worth fighting for, it doesn't matter how good your weapons are, right? If you have to have something worth fighting for, and they have something they believe is worth fighting for. And so that is why it still exists. And I've had people say to me, high officials, like, oh, it's so sweet, you're really nice that you like them so much, but they don't have a chance. They never had a chance. It's almost ridiculous that they have a map, that they exist, because they've always exceeded expectations, because it's hard to put into game theory that kind of commitment, and the fact that they have built it the way they have, so the people have ownership of it. It's really interesting. I just want to talk a little bit about the structure, because I think this is so important. So it's built by commune, which is like 130 families, never more than 300. It's very different in each area. So the residence has co-chairs, so women have duplicate roles, so it's man and women co-chairs. And then they have these 10 committees here: local administration, interior, social affairs, labor, women, economy. And the co-chairs of that, a man and a woman. And then they put several of those communes together to make a sub-district, several of those to make a district, several of those to make a canton. So the commune level, it's all volunteer. At the sub-district, district, canton, and the autonomous administration level, and of course, the regional level, it's all paid and full-time. and you run for it, so you're elected to that position. And although they haven't had elections in recent years because of what's going on with Turkey attacking, they're really anxious. In fact, the U.S. seems to be less interested because they want stability, but they really understand we need people elected, and we're a democracy. It's supposed to be that way. One of the things that's so interesting about this is it overrepresents the minorities. And I talked to some of the Syriac Assyrians that are a part of the government and aren't, because some of them aren't, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And they actually voted on what structure they would use, and they chose this one because they noticed that they were over represented. So when I was doing a deep dive on 4 of the regions, and I wasn't really sure what to expect, and so I was meeting with about 4 of the committees at every level of government, so it was like 4 committees in the commune, and then 4 committees, sub-district 4 committees. So I did this in 4 of the districts, and it was Raqqa, Tabqa, Euphrates, and Manbij. Mainly 3 of the Arabs, because I was really curious how the Arab areas were doing it. The Arabs really were the ones running it. I wanted to see for myself. So we showed up. They had no warning and started doing these interviews. Kobani, or Euphrates, which is where Kobani is, they said no to us the first day, and then we had to go back and wait them out because they weren't excited to have their day interrupted by me coming in and asking them questions. So that definitely was, I felt like we were really getting the real deal. And I was getting the names of the co-chairs for all the different committees and putting them in a spreadsheet and asking their ethnicity, their religion. And as I'm going through the spreadsheet, I'm like, wait, they're all different religions and ethnicities. Is that on purpose? There's no 3 Kurds and a Yazidi, or it's a Kurd, an Arab, a Circassian, a Yazidi. Everyone is, and for the women's committees, they have a chair, a woman, and then they have 4 vice chairs, but they stop when they run out of ethnicities and religions. So there could just be 3 co-chairs because there's only 3 different ethnicities and religions in that community. And so I'm like, did this on purpose? And they're like, yes, but most people lead with this stuff. They don't even tell you they do it because they're not doing it for us. They're doing it to change their community so that now, the women of Raqqa, they were telling me how they were told when the SDF was coming, they were scared and they told they were going to divide Syria and that they were afraid. And then when they came, they got to meet people from all these different ethnicities and religions they didn't even know lived nearby. And now they see they've actually come to unite them. I was just writing this down this is crazy stuff, but so interesting. And we always feel like at the Earth Roundtable, what we do is we bring together all the ethnicities and religions, and oftentimes people have never really worked together in a community. They might know, it seems like they see each other, but that's different. And I feel like they do, they have an Earth Roundtable at every level of a government. Every meeting is like an Earth Roundtable, because what they're doing is gathering all the ethnicities and religions together, and they're solving their own problems. And it's really quite interesting. Of course, it's not perfect, and I'm not pretending that it's perfect. And and that's the whole point of the U.S. could really provide support by just best practices and other governments too, and they could certainly use that. This is the demographics of North and East Syria. Take a look at the religious minorities that live there, and of course this is the Khabar. And while it's a map from 2018, it's still pretty much the same. If anything, there are less, of course, religious minorities. But it's still pretty accurate on how the breakdown is. So real quick, I wanted to go into showing the Turkish invasions. And I've worked with Freedom Research Foundation on the ground in Syria, and they've just done a really good job helping me understand what's going on there. And as you can see, Turkey has invaded 3 times, and I was able to go there in 2019. Right as they were invading, and go down to Tel Tamar during a break in the action and talk to the Syriac Assyrians there that had a clinic, and how many, they literally came through Syriac Assyrian villages. That's how they came in. It was almost like they knew that would make everyone more angry. It was hard to hear the kind of suffering that they went through as they did this, Operation Peace Spring. Genocide Watch said in 2020 that Turkey has committed war crimes and crimes against humanity, the way they came in, the amount of people they killed, and the way they did it. Turkish militia forces, according to Amnesty International, displayed a shameful disregard for civilian life, carrying out serious violations and war crimes, including summary killings and lawful attacks, and killed and injured civilians during the offensive in northeast Syria. And at a USERF hearing that we had, Amy Austin Holmes, at the time at the Wilson Center, said, that religious minorities had been killed, disappeared, kidnapped, raped, detained, subject to forced conversions, and held for ransom until their families could pay exorbitant sums of money to secure their release. Their places of worship had been destroyed, defaced, looted. Even their cemeteries had been demolished and vandalized. So these areas were all, the religious minority communities were decimated. And so many of them had to flee, and they were the fortunate ones. Last November, Turkey launched an extensive campaign of airstrikes in northeast Syria, and they targeted over 265 sites, led to 35 deaths. They even struck the U.S. base there, which didn't get a whole lot of press, just 130 meters from American personnel that they share with the SDF, and that was pretty shocking. The next day, while the U.S. urged restraint, Turkey conducted an airstrike on the security forces at Al Hol camp, allowing where 50,000 ISIS families live. Allowing a few families to escape that were recaught. And President Erdogan has also indicated his desire for another ground invasion with plans to go 30 kilometers deep, which is just about under 20 miles for this safe zone. And this is the map that he holds up to show what his safe zone would look like. So look at it with the demographic breakdown. Takes almost all the religious minorities out of northeast Syria. So, and of course, a lot of them that fled here fled to here. So like the ones here that are still in northeast Syria are still in dangerous areas. You know, the Kurdish National Council, which is the opposition to the autonomous administration, and they're aligned with Turkey, they're aligned with the KDP in Iraq. And they were so fed up with the crimes against Kurds, Christians, and Yazidis in Afrin that they even put out a statement in 2021 asking Turkey to stop it. So, I mean, you know, and they're part of the Syrian opposition, just showing you. But here is the UN report, again, on the Commission of Inquiry of the Syrian Arab Republic. It shows the percentage of violations against religious minorities, as you can see, you know, rape, inhumane, degrading treatment. You know, they really have targeted religious minorities, and Christians have paid a huge price. Myself, I've had a Zoom call with somebody from Afrin, an old man who was arrested when he had a funeral for his wife, a Christian funeral, and they had converted to Christianity like 20 years before. He's was arrested for apostasy and tortured for about a month. All his olive trees that have been there for hundreds of years were all cut down. And there were other people, he said a dozen others being held, but they had family in Turkey, so they couldn't have someone intervene for them because of the fear that something would happen to their family. So this is the kind of price the Christians have paid in places where Turkey is invaded and occupies. They basically recreated the ISIS caliphate, and Christians really can't live there. The only ones that do live there are very elderly, and they've all lost their homes. And a lot of Yazidis were very wealthy in Afrin, and they also lost their homes and are in hiding. I did want to mention, actually, we have Megan Bodette here, so you can ask her questions. Is the autonomous administration of northeast Syria the PKK, as Erdogan claims? I mean, it's always a good idea to just talk straight about this. It's no secret that leaders were part of the PKK in the past. Most Kurds in Syria and Turkey grew up not being able to identify as Kurdish or even speak Kurdish, not have a Kurdish name, listen to Kurdish music. Many young people joined the PKK to fight that. The U.S. does not believe any of the leaders of the autonomous administration are now the PKK or they answer to the PKK. But it's important to note that there is no military solution to this conflict between Turkey and the PKK, or they call the Kurdish question. You know, so many of the Kurds in Turkey, the mayors have been replaced. I mean, this is way broader than just northeast Syria, and it's, at one point they were having negotiations, and it was looking like there could be even a settlement in 2014, and then Erdogan just turned it off and decided to go after them, and I think he saw this as a way to expand. And so, you know, Amy Austin Holmes did a paper at the Wilson Center under James Jeffrey, by the way, who was there when it got reported, that showed there were no cross-border attacks from Syria to Turkey. The only ones that happened were in defense, actually, when they were attacking. And so to say northeast Syria is a threat to Turkey is like saying Taiwan is a threat to China. There's not a chance. But no one has paid a bigger price than the Syrian villages in both the Kaaba Rally and Commission of these areas, the Christians here, and also in Iraq in the border there. So many of the Assyrian villages have also been emptied out because Turkey is fighting the PKK in areas that there's not even PKK. And so if we're going to see a settlement, it's not a military one. And so hopefully the U.S. and other governments that want to see there be a settlement with this will step in and help push Turkey. This is a really good report that just came out that kind of goes through the conflict and gives you a lot more information. I highly recommend that you read it. I'm almost done. Thanks for your patience. This is 2023. Unfortunately, in February, there was a horrific, devastating earthquake. Over 50,000 were killed. The UN Refugee Agency said after 12 years of conflict, humanitarian conditions continue to deteriorate in northwest Syria due to ongoing hostilities, a worsening economic crisis, and the aftermath of devastating earthquakes. Just a few months before this happened, they had reported that 90% of Syria lived in poverty, and prices had increased 800% in the last 2 years. Now, part of that is the Caesar sanctions really devalued their currency in a big way. So here these people could not be hurting anymore, and then this earthquake happens, and it's so sad, but really, if you remember the map we looked at, it hit Idlib, it hit Afrin hard, Aleppo, so it hit regime areas. All the areas we're talking about, all were hit very hard, and the autonomous administration has an area that they control outside of Aleppo that was also hit very hard. They say over 3.7 million children are facing a deepening crisis right now, and there's a lot of great work being done by Christian organizations and through churches, both Orthodox, Catholic, evangelical. I know the Shai Fund with Charmaine Heading is doing amazing work. Global Christian Relief is doing amazing work. And of course, Assad is preoccupied with the political opportunities he has now being accepted back into the global community. They've now accepted Syria back into the Arab League. And let's face it, it doesn't appear like he's going anywhere. 12 years into the civil war, 500,000 Syrians have been killed. They say 55,000 murdered by torture in prisons. Half the population has fled. 6.8 million are internally displaced, and 6 million are refugees abroad. And they say about 150 million Christians have fled. I think those that could have. So the people who remain now struggle with lack of basic necessities like water, electricity, infrastructure. And I think the Christians that could afford to leave probably have. So what we have are really most of the people in Syria now. If they haven't left already, it's because they're really struggling and their families are struggling. I think that's an important thing for us to think about how we can help them. Most Christian patriarch and church leaders in Syria have remained committed to President Bashar al-Assad. Despite the horrific crimes, or maybe because of them, this loyalty has provided protection for their members across the country, including deferrals for men from the ages of 18 to 42. Can you believe that? 18 to 42 men are conscripted to go into the military there. So if you're Christian, you get deferrals, but then you're a hostage. And they usually send them far away, so it's not like they're working close by. You know, even in the Khabur Valley, I was talking to a family that their son goes to Damascus and gets a deferral. Because if they do that, then he's able to leave the country, he's able to travel, able to go to school in Damascus, able to leave the Northeast. But then his family's now a hostage to Assad. So even people in Northeast Syria that support the autonomous administration are thankful for the conditions they have. I want to say 10% of the Christians are involved in the government, and that's it. The rest of them can't, because the cost is too great for them politically. If there was any sense that the autonomous administration had a lasting future, that they knew it was going to last, they would. But it's a really difficult situation. It's hard for us to judge. I think it's super important to just know, if by the grace of God, it could be me and my family, and what would I do? Of course, I'd want my family to live. And I know early on in the opposition, the Christians that did stood up, they disappeared. The pastors disappeared. The leaders disappeared. So there's quite a bit of fear. Okay, hold on here. So these are some of my takeaways, and then I'll do some recommendations. Rethink U.S. policy in Syria completely. I mean, when we've gotten it this wrong, and the UN and this whole process that was just looked like it was good on paper, but never had any chance in real life. And with the autonomous administration as the only successful government in Syria, how can we build on them for further peace and stability? And consider actions to support the civilians in Syria. So rethink all of U.S. policy. Like the sanctions. We got sanctions lifted on Northeast Syria, which was really big. And USURF had made that recommendation because we often have recommended that governments penalize with sanctions. Why not reward a government with taking away sanctions? But has sanctions helped? Have they made it harder on Assad? I mean, we need to find out. There should be research done. Has it, or has it only hurt the civilians? I mean, those are kind of things we should understand. There's a couple of different sanctions. There's the Caesar sanctions that were really on Assad and the Maklouf family, the elites basically of Syria, and then there were the executive sanctions that were put on by the White House. And so the White House could lift the executive ones. The Caesar sanctions have to be done by Congress. And with the autonomous administration being so ignored, and of course the U.S., didn't talk to them for so long. I mean, if a third of Syria is working and has peace for families, then what can we do to build on that, rather than trying to figure out at this point still an intractable situation with Assad being in charge? I think that it's important to understand that, like, right now we have troops in northeast Syria providing stability, and as the autonomous administration continues to grow and be able to be independent, I think the goal would be at some point in time troops need to be gone. But to pull troops now with the situation the way it is, with the way that Turkey has brought this instability with all their attacks, and continue to attack. I wouldn't say they shell the Khabur Valley almost daily. So they signed a ceasefire with the U.S. in 2019, and they continued to violate it. But the U.S. looks away because it's like just shelling. It's not like they do big attacks. But obviously, people die all the time, and a lot of times they're farmers just trying to till their land. So, as the autonomous administration becomes stronger, and if economically they could have the opportunity to take advantage of these sanctions, they'd be in a better position to be able to, at some point in time, make a deal with Assad to be able to continue to grow, because that looks like what it's going to probably have to be. And so, so I'm going to talk about some of the recommendations. Oh, okay. I will just keep this here, and I'll just go through these. So I'll go through some of this. Too many recommendations to really put on a slide, so I'll just kind of talk them through. To continue to support the autonomous administration, help them learn best practices, develop their government, because that's a place where Christians and all religious minorities can live. And so that would be number one. Like the U.S. did in Iraq, they should engage the U.S. International Development Trade Corporation and the U.S. Trade Department to package and encourage businesses to invest now that sanctions in the Northeast have been lifted. And that's something easy that they could do. One of the USAR's recommendations is to demand the inclusion of the autonomous administration in all U.S.-backed final solutions per UN Resolution 2254 as a basis for the Syrian-led and Syrian-owned political transition. And if Turkey vetoes their inclusion, they should run a parallel process in Geneva. And I think another looking at Turkey is to really make the cost too high for Turkey to invade again. And I think this government has done that. And to pressure Turkey to abide by those ceasefires that we talked about, so that these, especially like I think the Khabur Valley, they're still tilling in dangerous areas because they have nowhere else to go, and it's the only way they can feed their families. And prioritize a political solution to the Turkish-Kurdish question. It's the only way for long-term stability. And of course, keep troops in northeast Syria, one of the best returns on investments for security and stability in the region. And I think the State Department the Department of Defense makes a really good point on this. Like I said earlier, they're the one government, it's the one area doing what all of our military partners should do, which is build governance to hold the land so we don't have to come back and do it again. Stopping a forever war, that's how you do it. You build governance, and when that's something, for whatever reason, has not been the priority when we've been involved in military operations. I think the U.S. government should sanction Turkish-backed militias more that are involved in human rights violations, and hold Turkey accountable for the ones that they're under their control. Sanction Idlib's militias and involved in human rights violations, and we have seen the U.S. government do sanctions for both of these. And increase humanitarian aid for civilians by continuing sanction relief for earthquake victims in the regime area. So right now they did do a waiver, executive order allowing all humanitarian work because of the earthquake. But it was kind of it wasn't necessary because there's always been a waiver for anyone doing humanitarian work in Syria. But they did it just to make it clear to everyone, really, you can come in, we promise. Because I think everyone is like, there's a waiver, but they're kind of afraid, and banks don't believe you. And so I do think, because banks are so afraid of sanctions, that doing that again or extending that longer would be super important for the U.S. government to do, even though you can legally do sanctions right now. I mean, go in and work humanitarian without any sanctions on you, and you don't have to worry about it at all. And of course, include religious freedom in any political solution. Second, we need to support Christians and other religious and ethnic minorities in Syria. Those living in the regime areas especially need our help. There's a lot of churches on the ground still. various denominations that are providing care, and there's a lot of good organizations like the ones I mentioned that would be willing, that are doing programs on the ground to help them. The other thing that we're really excited about at our Secretariat is we have been working with the Shy Fund in Charmaine Heading, who has started over 100 businesses in the Nineveh Plains and in Northeast Syria with Christians and Yazidis. And they're between $5,000 and $8,000. You can start a grocery store, a mechanic store, a beauty store, a stationery, a recording studio, painting, construction. She has videos on every single one of them, and I was able to meet some of the people, businesses she started when I was in there. I visited a new recording studio that's dubbing things, and it's a Syrian family that runs it. And they have all the state-of-the-art equipment. And, you know, like in Northeast Syria, we look at Northeast Syria as a perfect example. Okay, so they have religious freedom. But if you can't feed your family, it's great, you can go to church. But if we really want to support religious minorities, having the ability to go to church is obviously a big part of it, but they also need to be able to feed their families. So I think that, you know, we just pitched to a bunch of businesses, like at a business conference with the Religious Freedom Business Foundation, about this idea of them partnering to try to support religious minorities, not just there, hopefully a variety of religious minorities, to help them to be able to stay in their homeland. And I think that's something we can do. And so I really do appreciate your time tonight, and I'm willing to, of course, answer any questions if I can. And thanks so much.
Anyone who has a question, I might just sit up here on the side. While folks gather their thoughts, I'll go ahead and ask the first question. You mentioned UN Resolution 2254 and the importance of having the ANES, the Autonomous Administration, participate, have a seat at the table. The question I'd like to ask, closely related to that, is what is the Autonomous Administration's ultimate vision for a future of Syria and their place in that future Syria?
So they don't want to be an independent government. They have never wanted to be. So that's, again, a narrative that you might hear from the Turkish-backed folks. So they want to be like a state in a future Syria. And they think Syria should be federalized. And they have the Syrian Democratic Council, which is like an umbrella that's supposed to work for all of Syria. And really, the Druze would come up with their own way of governing, not like they do, but whatever works for them, so that each area could come up with their own way of governing, and that could be a way forward for all of Syria. So that's how they foresee them being a part. But they don't, in fact, they don't even call their officials ministers. They call them offices, because they know their state a state. They're not they don't have a minister of anything. They have officials. So they're trying to be very cognizant of not looking like they want independence, and they know they couldn't survive independently in this this reality of the Middle East.
Thank you.
Sure. Any other questions? Yes. Okay. I know I covered all the information.
You got a full semester in about 40 minutes.
I was going to say,
Yeah.
every slide deserved an entire evening, and that's what the struggle was, trying to, what to talk about, what not to talk about.
Nadine, that was great. Thank you so much.
thank you.
Mine's on the autonomous administration as well. What the heck was wrong with the U.S. administration? Why didn't they support it from the get-go?
Yeah, so it's so interesting that you say that. Part of it was Turkey, and they didn't want to make Turkey angry, and it was so interesting, the different mindset than you have now about Turkey. I mean, now I think everyone knows. There's just a different view of Turkey now, and there's a lot of them the same people. So the top people switch with administrations, but a lot of the staff stays the same. So a lot of them are the same people. They're no longer quite as harshly. And even the thing that happened that I was told in the administration is even the very pro-Turkey people started like saying, okay, we got to get them to stop. Because like if you're a big fan and you're like always, supporting Turkey and being an advocate for them, you probably want them to kind of pull back a little too, because it's not going to age so well. So I think that it was a different time, and I think and I'll be honest, President Trump had a close relationship with Erdogan, so there was a lot of fear internally in the government of what to do. I know there was a little fear of me in particular, and I would just show up in Syria and no one knew what to do with that. And a couple years later, literally, they're like helping me get to Syria. So it's like a different, mindset in terms of me being able to go. So I think a lot of it was a different time. I mean, I remember one ex of the senior staffs, he was at a talk like this, and somebody asked him about the Autonomous Administration, and he said, we want something better for Syria than the Autonomous Administration. And this was like in 2020, and I was like, Like, please tell me how an American like you is going to go in and do something better than this. I mean, so basically he was kind of mad they wrote their own constitution. They didn't, they did everything themselves. Guess what? That's the only way it works. We're not good at nation building. We should not be nation building. So when people want to pull troops and they want to say, pull American out of everywhere because we just mess everything up, they're not wrong, because we do. But the point is that it's a little different because they've actually stepped up to the plate and done what they've done. They protect religious minorities. It's the one place religious minorities can live and be safe. In fact, the autonomous administration, the leader, Badran Jia-Kurd, who's their co-chair of the foreign office, because they don't have ministers, has just invited all the Syrian refugees that are getting kicked out of Turkey to come to the autonomous administration. They're setting up a camp for them. Now, obviously, they don't have the funds to do this, so they're going to need international support. But they could be a sanctuary for people to come and be safe. But economically, it's super important that they're able to get on their feet. They have sanctions lifted. But Turkey, and that's part of the reason, literally the day the sanctions were announced, Turkey started bombing and never stopped. And so it was, and I knew businesses that were coming in, and they were just they couldn't. So that has been a big piece of it. And I think if they could grow their economy, they have 80% of the oil in Syria. They have the most fertile land with the Fertile Crescent. And every year that I went to Syria, it would be orange, kind of the sky would look like it does in New York right now, that nice orange color. And actually when I was there in March, it was green. And the Khabar, I just saw pictures, the Khabar is full. And even though, now Turkey's built 3 more dams in the area that they invaded in Ras Al Ain. So the Khabar, when I was there in March, was dry. I mean, literally was dry. And it's now full. And because they can't even hold back all the water. So they've actually had a bumper crop this year. And it's been a real blessing, and they've been growing. I mean, it's green. It doesn't even look, it's crazy. It doesn't look like Syria. It looks like northern Iraq, actually. It's very green. And so, but that's not something sustainable. And so the one thing we did find is, we were in the Khabar Valley, the one thing the farmers could use probably most of all with NGOs would be solar panels, because they don't have enough electricity. They don't have enough gas to be able to run their generators. And they could farm if they had solar panels, because then they could pump water from their wells if they're able to have wells. I think half of them on the Khabar Valley have wells that work. So at least those half that are away from Turkey and that have wells could actually continue to farm. And right now they've had enough rain to be able to not even have to use their wells. Yeah, so it's been really, really a blessing. Finally, they got a little bit of a break for once. Any other questions? Yep.
I've got one.
Sure.
Can you talk a little bit more about the recent trend of the Middle East seeming to embrace Assad, particularly them rejoining the Gulf Summit, reopening embassies? What does that mean for the Northeast and for U.S. policy in Syria?
Yeah, it's really complicated. I think the problem is he's not going anywhere. Like, if he has survived all of this, he's been propped up by, of course, Russia and Iran. He would have never lasted without Russia coming to his defense. I think that's just super important to understand. I didn't have time to talk about all of the and all the bombings Russia did to save them and all that. And so, he's been propped up by all these governments. But nevertheless, I think the sense is he's not going anywhere. And of course, the Syrian opposition fell apart. And now that Turkey wants to actually make a deal with Assad, they're really no longer supporting the opposition. The opposition's still kind of there. But the opposition, as you know, was never the same on the ground as it was in these places. And so it never was something the people of Syria could support. It was always the thing people in the capitals of every city supported. And like I said, I've met some of them, and some of them are wonderful people. Some of them haven't been wonderful people. Some of them are wonderful people. A lot of them are Christians. And they wanted a lot of them paid huge prices. And so I think what happened is these governments all saw that. They saw how it all fell apart. And if we don't make it, and they all want something from him, right? He has a deep port. He's got, and of course the drugs coming into all these countries, coming through Syria. Captagon is just in Saudi Arabia and all these places. I think they'd like to get a handle on that. So, I think they're being pragmatic in wanting to protect their own governments by getting ahead and not being on the wrong side of Assad, and maybe they can control the drug trade and do other things that might protect their own country. But it's definitely a disappointment. It's complicated for the United States. And so there's a lot of anger that it seems like they're not being hard enough against this happening, but yet what's it's tough. So the autonomous administration will likely have to make a deal with Assad to at some point in time, if they're going to be an autonomous region in Syria and if he's going to stay. Obviously, the goal was always someone else would take over and they'd be a state in a future Syria. That hasn't happened. I'm not saying they want, because then there are other people that are mad that they think that they talk to Assad. Well, they're not friends. So but I can assure you, they're the only part of Syria that was successful against Assad. Assad's not a fan. Any of this talk that they're fans, there's always, in fact, there was just fighting around Kamishli, where there's always something going on between their forces. They're not, but at some point in time, they need to come to an agreement. So the autonomous administration needs an agreement with Turkey, and they need an agreement with Assad. So these are high bars. The international community can be a big part of that. In fact, they're going to have to be in order for either of those players to be willing to accept the Northeast. But you have 100,000 trained fighters as the Syrian Democratic Forces, and the Arab forces, the Christian forces. They're not going to lay their weapons down. So whatever happens, it's going to be messy, and a lot of people are going to die, and ultimately the ground will probably be held by Islamists. So I think it's in the best interest of the United States to try to figure out how they can make a deal for them, help them to be able to get in the good graces of these other governments in the region, and for the regions to see how stability benefits all of them, unless it doesn't. And of course, Iran is always looking for instability in some of these other governments. So they have all the time in the world. That's what it is. We always have, we do policy every 2 years, and they do policy 25, 50, 100 years, so they have all the time. They're in no rush. They'll just keep moving over. And of course, Iran has taken over neighborhoods in Damascus, and with all this chaos in the last couple of years, you see them coming into the Northeast. So it's a real problem for sure. And so hopefully what we need is the U.S. to continue to stand with the autonomous administration, help make these deals, help keep borders open into the autonomous administration, and them to be able to, because I think the stronger they are economically, the better position they'd be to be able to make a good deal for themselves. Any others? Okay, thank you. Oh, thanks for having me.
Thank you so much, Nadine, for that interesting talk. Obviously, I've had conversations with many experts and advocates on this issue, but nobody with more passion or authority than you. So thank you for being here tonight with us. I'd like to take this opportunity just to plug our July event, which will feature the Philos Project Research Fellow at IDC, Max Prowant, who is with us tonight. I think he just stepped out, maybe. He'll be talking about his findings, his 2022 research project findings on Boko Haram and Al-Shabaab. So that'll be in July. Please stay tuned for details. That'll be a very interesting conversation. Also, a shameless plug for the IDC podcast called In the Middle, because in the middle is where Christians in the Middle East, of course, that's where they find themselves, stuck in the middle. Episode 4 just dropped last week. That one's called The Plight of the First Christian Nation. First Christian nation being Armenia, where we discuss the history of the Armenian people, church, and nation, and the current struggles and threats that face that small nation. All episodes of In the Middle can be found on all your major podcast platforms, including Spotify, and YouTube seems to be the most accessible for the most number of people, so you can certainly find it there as well. Thanks for being here. Thanks again, Nadine. There's more food there. I invite you all to enjoy it and stay for fellowship. Thanks for joining.